The wagon wheels creaked their final protest as Clara Bell slipped away from the sleeping convoy, her worn boots making barely a whisper against the dusty earth. The moon hung low over the Colorado Territory, casting long shadows across the sagebrush and juniper trees that dotted the landscape. She clutched a small bundle containing her few remaining possessions, a tintype photograph of her late father, his pocket watch, and the last of the hardtack she'd saved from dinner. It had been 3 days since they'd buried Papa beside the trail, his body finally succumbing to the fever that had plagued him since independence. 3 days since Uncle Silas had informed her, with whiskey-sour breath and greedy eyes, that she'd be wed to Luther Briggs at the next settlement. Luther, whose first wife had died under mysterious circumstances, whose heavy fists were as legendary as his drinking. Clara moved deeper into the wilderness, away from the snoring forms around the dying campfires. She'd rather take her chances with wolves and rattlesnakes than become another casualty of Luther's temper. The October wind bit through her thin calico dress, but she pressed on, following a deer trail that wound up into the foothills. By dawn, her legs trembled with exhaustion. The convoy would have discovered her absence by now, but she doubted Uncle Silas would waste much time searching. One less mouth to feed. One less burden to carry to California. He'd already pocketed the bride price Luther had paid, 2 mules and a Winchester rifle. The sun climbed higher, and with it came an oppressive heat that seemed at odds with the previous night's chill. Clara's throat burned with thirst. She'd finished her water hours ago, and the landscape stretched endlessly before her. A sea of gray-green sage and red rock. Panic began to creep in at the edges of her mind. What foolishness had driven her into this wasteland with no plan, no destination? Then, like a miracle, she heard it, the gentle babbling of water over stones. Following the sound, she crested a small rise and gasped. Below, nestled in a grove of cottonwoods and willows, lay a pristine mountain lake. The water sparkled sapphire blue in the morning light, fed by a small waterfall cascading down the rocky cliff face. Clara half ran, half stumbled down the slope, dropping to her knees at the water's edge. She cupped the cold, clear liquid in her hands, drinking deeply. It tasted of snow and granite, the finest thing she'd experienced in months of trail dust and alkali water. After slaking her thirst, Clara sat back on her heels and surveyed her surroundings. The lake was perhaps 100 yards across, perfectly circular, surrounded by smooth boulders and sandy beaches. Cottonwood leaves rustled overhead, their golden autumn colors reflecting in the still water. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe, hidden, protected by the natural walls of the canyon. The sun had climbed to its zenith, and her dress clung to her skin with dried sweat and trail grime. She looked down at herself, her once white chemise now gray with dust, her skirts torn and stained. When had she last bathed properly? Not since they'd crossed the Platte River, weeks ago. Clara glanced around again. The grove seemed completely isolated, no sign of human habitation anywhere. She could hear nothing but birdsong and the splash of the waterfall. Surely she was alone here, safe enough for what she desperately needed, a proper wash. With trembling fingers, she began unlacing her boots, then peeled off her stockings, sighing as her feet touched the cool sand. The dress came next, then her petticoats, chemise, and undergarments, each layer of clothing revealing skin that hadn't seen sunlight in months. She folded everything carefully on a flat boulder, weighing them down with smaller rocks against the breeze. The first step into the lake made her gasp. The water was colder than she'd expected, mountain-fed and pure. But as she waded deeper, her body adjusted, and she felt months of trail dirt begin to dissolve. She dove under, letting the water flow through her tangled hair, emerging with a laugh of pure joy. For a blessed few minutes, Clara forgot everything: Papa's death, Uncle Silas's betrayal, Luther's looming threat. She was simply a young woman in a beautiful lake, washing away the sorrows of the trail. She found a bar of lye soap in her bundle and scrubbed herself thoroughly, even managing to work the worst tangles from her long auburn hair. She was floating on her back, watching clouds drift across the canyon walls. When she heard them, the unmistakable sound of horses' hooves on stone, the jingle of spurs, and, worst of all, male laughter. Clara's eyes flew open. 3 riders had emerged from the tree line on the opposite shore. Young men in worn chaps and wide-brimmed hats. Cowboys, by the look of them. Probably heading back to one of the scattered ranches after a night in town. They hadn't spotted her yet, too busy passing a bottle between them and jawing about something. Heart pounding. Clara ducked low in the water, using a large boulder near the shore as cover. If she could just stay hidden until they watered their horses and moved on. But then one of them, a lanky youth with straw-colored hair, pointed toward the shore where her clothes lay folded. "Well, well, boys. Looky what we got here." The 3 men dismounted, approaching her clothing with growing interest and amusement. The tallest one, dark-bearded and rough-looking, held up her chemise. "Seems we got ourselves a mermaid in this here lake." "Come on out, little fish," another called, scanning the water. "We know you're in there." Clara pressed herself against the boulder, shivering now from more than cold. The water that had felt so protective moments ago now seemed a trap. "Tell you what," the bearded one said loudly, gathering up all her clothing into a bundle. "We'll just take these pretty things with us. If the lady wants 'em back, she can come fetch 'em at the Lazy J Ranch." They laughed uproariously at this, as if it were the finest joke ever told. "Please," Clara called out, her voice cracking. "Please, just leave them. I have nothing else." This only made them laugh harder. "Then you'd best hurry along to the ranch, hadn't you?" the blonde one said. They mounted their horses, her entire bundle of clothing tied to one of their saddles. With whoops and hollers, they spurred their mounts back into the trees, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls long after they'd disappeared. Clara remained frozen in place, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. They'd taken everything, her dress, her undergarments, her boots, even her father's photograph and watch, tucked in the pocket of her dress. She had nothing now but her bare skin and the cold water that suddenly felt like ice. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, and with it would come the high country cold. She couldn't stay in the water, but neither could she leave it. Tears of frustration and fear streamed down her face as she moved to shallower water, still using the boulders for cover. Time passed, an hour, maybe 2. The shadows grew longer, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Clara's teeth chattered uncontrollably. Her fingers and toes had gone numb. She knew she had to do something or she'd die here. But what? Walk naked through the wilderness? Even if she could bear the shame, she'd freeze to death before finding help. She was on the verge of complete despair when she heard it. A different sound from before. A single horse, moving slowly, deliberately. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Had one of them come back? Or was this someone else, someone potentially worse? The rider emerged from a different trail. Following the lake's eastern shore, Clara could make out a tall figure atop a bay horse, moving with the easy grace of someone who lived in the saddle. Unlike the cowboys, this man was alone, quiet, seeming to study the ground as he rode. As he drew closer, she could see more details, broad shoulders beneath a worn leather duster, a black hat pulled low over his face, a rifle in a saddle scabbard. He appeared older than the cowboys, maybe 30 years or more, with the weathered look of a man who'd spent his life under the open sky. The horse stopped to drink at the lake's edge, not 50 feet from where Clara hid. The man dismounted, stretching his back, then knelt to fill his canteen. That's when he noticed the marks in the sand, footprints, both booted and bare. The disturbed area where the cowboys had stood. His head came up sharply, hand moving instinctively to the Colt at his hip. Dark eyes, she could see they were dark even from this distance, scanned the water systematically. "Help!" Clara called out, her voice barely above a whisper, then louder, desperation overcoming shame. "Please, sir, please help me." The man stood slowly, his hand moving away from his gun. "Where are you, miss?" "Behind the rocks," she managed through chattering teeth. They took my clothes, everything. Please, I need help." For a long moment, he stood perfectly still, as if carved from the same stone as the canyon walls. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back to his horse. And Clara's heart sank. He was leaving. Just like everyone else had left her, Papa to death, Uncle Silas to greed, and now this stranger to propriety or indifference. But instead of mounting, the man untied something from behind his saddle, a heavy buffalo robe. He walked back to the shore, then turned his back to the lake, holding the robe out behind him. "Can you make it this far?" His voice was low, gruff, but not unkind. Clara had no choice. On trembling legs, she waded toward shore, keeping as low in the water as possible until the very last moment. Then she stumbled onto the sand and into the offered robe. The man's strong hands helped wrap it around her shaking form, all while keeping his eyes averted. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the warm fur around her. "Thank you." He nodded curtly, then moved to his horse, returning with a pair of worn leather boots, much too large for her feet, but better than nothing. "Can you ride?" When she nodded, he lifted her effortlessly onto his horse, then swung up behind her. She was too exhausted, too cold, too overwhelmed to feel anything but gratitude for the solid warmth of another human being at her back, for the strong arms that guided the horse away from the lake that had nearly become her grave. As they rode into the gathering dusk, Clara caught a glimpse of his face in profile, strong jaw darkened with stubble, a straight nose, lines carved by sun and wind around his eyes. He smelled of leather and wood smoke, sage and something indefinably male. "Jed Hartley," he said after they'd ridden in silence for several minutes. "Got a place not far from here." "Clara Bell," she managed through still chattering teeth. I'm grateful, Mr. Hartley." He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement, might have been dismissal, but his arm tightened slightly around her when she shivered, and he urged the horse to a faster pace, behind them. The lake disappeared into shadow, keeping its secrets. Ahead, a thin column of smoke rose from somewhere among the pines, promising warmth and shelter and, perhaps, safety, things Clara Bell had thought she'd never find again. The cabin materialized from the darkness like something conjured from the mountain itself. Rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, a stone chimney releasing a steady stream of smoke into the star-filled sky. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a lean-to stable attached to one side and a well-built corral nearby. Simple, isolated, but solid as the mountains that sheltered it. Jed Hartley dismounted first, then reached up to help Clara down. Her legs, numb from cold and exhaustion, buckled beneath her. He caught her easily, one arm around her waist, steadying her until she found her footing. The buffalo robe had slipped during the ride, and she clutched it desperately around herself, acutely aware of her vulnerability. "Go on inside," he said, nodding toward the door. "I'll see to the horse." Clara hobbled to the cabin, the oversized boots flopping with each step. The door opened on well-oiled hinges, revealing a single room lit by the dying embers in the fieldstone fireplace. It was Spartan but clean, a narrow bed with a quilt, a rough table and 2 chairs, shelves holding tin plates and cups, a few books and supplies, a man's space, lived in but not truly inhabited. She stood shivering in the doorway until Jed entered behind her, carrying an armload of split wood. Without speaking, he knelt at the hearth and built up the fire until it crackled with new life. The warmth hit Clara like a physical thing, and she moved closer, holding her hands out to the flames. "There's clothes in that trunk," Jed said, pointing to a leather-bound chest near the bed. "Might find something that'll do." He turned his back, busying himself at the small stove, giving her privacy. Clara opened the trunk carefully, finding men's shirts, worn but clean, and a pair of canvas trousers. At the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, lay a woman's dress, blue calico with tiny yellow flowers, carefully preserved but years out of fashion. She hesitated, then took one of the shirts and the trousers, leaving the dress untouched. The clothes hung on her slight frame like a child playing dress-up, but they were warm and dry. She rolled up the sleeves and trouser legs as best she could, then cleared her throat softly. "I'm decent." Jed turned from the stove where he'd set a pot to heating. His dark eyes swept over her once, quickly, then returned to his task. "Sit, you need food." Clara sank into one of the chairs, exhaustion hitting her like a physical blow now that she was warm and safe. She watched Jed move about the small space with economical grace, slicing bread, ladling what smelled like venison stew into bowls, setting a cup of something hot and steaming before her. "Coffee," he said at her questioning look. "Might be a bit strong." It was strong enough to float a horseshoe, but Clara drank it gratefully, feeling warmth spread through her belly. The stew was simple but good, chunks of meat, wild onions, and potatoes in a rich gravy. She ate like a starved thing, which she supposed she was. Jed sat across from her with his own bowl but seemed more interested in watching her eat than in his own meal. The firelight cast shadows across his weathered face, highlighting the lines around his eyes, the firm set of his jaw. He had the look of a man who'd seen too much and expected to see worse. "You were with the wagon train," he said finally. "Not a question." Clara nodded, setting down her spoon. They're heading for California. My father—" Her voice caught. "He died of fever 4 days ago. My uncle was taking me the rest of the way. But you left." She met his steady gaze. "My uncle sold me to a man named Luther Briggs. Said it was for my own good, that I needed a husband to protect me." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Luther's protection would have killed me faster than any wilderness danger." Jed's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "They got no right," he said simply. Those 4 words, spoken without emotion, without judgment, just a statement of fact, broke something inside Clara. The tears came then. All the grief and fear and anger she'd held back flooding out in great, gulping sobs. She covered her face with her hands, ashamed of breaking down in front of this stranger. A chair scraped, and she felt rather than saw Jed move. But instead of coming closer, he stepped outside, giving her privacy to grieve. Through her tears, Clara felt a rush of gratitude for his understanding. When the storm of weeping finally passed, she wiped her face on her sleeve and found him standing on the porch, a silent sentinel against the night. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He shook his head. "Nothing to be sorry for." He came back inside, refilled her coffee cup, then returned to his chair. "You can sleep here tonight. Take the bed. I'll make do." "I couldn't—" "You'll take the bed," he repeated, his tone ending any argument. "Tomorrow we'll figure what's to be done." Clara wanted to protest further, but exhaustion was winning. Jed banked the fire and laid out blankets on the floor near the hearth while she crawled into the narrow bed. The quilt smelled of cedar and smoke, and despite everything, she felt safer than she had in months. She woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window and the sound of an axe biting into wood. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back, the lake, the cowboys, Jed Hartley's rescue. She sat up, running fingers through her tangled hair. Jed's clothes still hung on her like sacks, but they were all she had. She found him outside, splitting logs with mechanical precision, his shirt damp with sweat despite the morning chill. He'd removed his duster, and she could see the play of muscles across his back and shoulders with each swing of the axe. He noticed her and set the axe aside. "There's biscuits and bacon inside. Coffee's hot." Clara ate standing at the window, watching him work. He moved to the corral next, checking the horse's hooves, mending a broken fence rail. Everything he did was methodical, careful, the movements of a man who'd learned to rely only on himself. When she ventured outside, he was sitting on the porch steps, working saddle soap into a bridle. Clara sat beside him, careful to leave space between them. "I should move on," she said quietly. "I've imposed enough." His hands never paused in their work. "Where would you go?" The question hung in the air. Where indeed? She had no money, no clothes, no destination. Uncle Silas wouldn't want her back, and she'd rather die than return to Luther Briggs. "I don't know," she admitted. Then you'll stay until you do. He said it like it was already decided. Can't have you wandering the mountains in my spare clothes. People would talk. Despite everything, Clara almost smiled. I can work, cook, clean, mend. I won't be a burden. He finally looked at her then, really looked at her. Didn't say you were. They fell into a pattern over the following days. Clara took over the domestic chores, cooking meals, washing clothes in the stream, keeping the cabin tidy. She discovered Jed's life was one of rigid routine, up before dawn to tend the horses, checking trap lines, hunting when meat ran low, endless repairs to cabin and equipment. He had a small herd of cattle in a meadow further up the mountain and would disappear for hours to check on them. On the fourth day, while cleaning, Clara found the trunk again. This time, she carefully lifted out the blue dress, shaking out the folds. It was well made, with tiny stitches and mother-of-pearl buttons. A woman with loving hands had sewn this dress. It was my mother's. Clara jumped, not having heard Jed enter. He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. She died when I was 12, lung fever. He moved past her to hang his hat on a peg. You can alter it if you've a mind to. No use it sitting in that trunk forever. I couldn't. It's just cloth. But his voice held a roughness that said otherwise. She was a practical woman. Wouldn't want it wasted. That evening, by lamplight, Clara began taking in the seams. Jed sat across from her, cleaning his rifle, but she caught him watching her work. There was something deeply intimate about altering his mother's dress while he looked on, as if she were stepping into a space that had been empty for a very long time. Why do you live out here alone? She asked softly, not looking up from her stitching. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, it's simpler. Simpler than what? He set down the rifle, his hands resting on the table. Then trying to live where people think they know you, where they've already decided what you are. Clara's needle paused. She sensed a story there, a wound as deep as her own. But Jed's face had closed off again, and she knew better than to push. Some pain was too private to share with someone you'd known only days. The next morning, Clara emerged from behind the blanket she'd strung up for privacy, wearing the altered dress. It fit reasonably well now, though the style was 2 decades out of date. She'd braided her hair and pinned it up. And for the first time since leaving the wagon train, she felt somewhat like herself again. Jed was pouring coffee when she stepped into view. His hand stilled, the pot suspended in mid-air. Something passed across his face, surprise, maybe, or recognition, or something deeper she couldn't name. Then he finished pouring and handed her the cup, his fingers brushing hers for just an instant. It suits you, he said gruffly, then grabbed his hat and headed outside. Clara stood there, cup warming her hands, feeling as if something had shifted between them. The dress had made her real somehow. Not just a refugee he'd rescued, but a woman in his space. And from the way he'd looked at her, quick as lightning but intense as summer thunder, she wasn't the only one aware of the change. Outside, she could hear him chopping wood with more force than necessary. And despite everything that had happened, everything that might yet happen, Clara Bell found herself almost smiling. The October days settled into a rhythm as steady as breathing. Clara rose each morning to find Jed already gone, the coffee pot warm on the stove and biscuits waiting under a clean cloth. She'd tidy the cabin, tend the small garden patch she'd discovered behind the house, then start preparations for the midday meal. When Jed returned, they'd eat in companionable silence, the space between them filled with unspoken understanding. But beneath the routine ran an undercurrent of awareness. Clara noticed how Jed's eyes would follow her when he thought she wasn't looking, how he'd find excuses to work near the cabin instead of ranging far into the mountains. She caught herself watching for his return, listening for the sound of his horse, feeling a flutter of something dangerous when his tall form appeared through the trees. They were careful with each other, maintaining a polite distance. Jed had strung up a rope and blanket to give her privacy in one corner of the cabin, and he still slept on the floor by the fire. refusing her repeated offers to take turns with the bed. But the cabin was small, and they couldn't avoid the occasional accidental touch, fingers meeting over a dish, shoulders brushing in the narrow doorway. Each contact sent sparks through Clara that she tried desperately to ignore. The change came on a crisp Tuesday morning. Clara had volunteered to help gather the last of the wild onions from the meadow before frost killed them off. She followed Jed up a steep trail, her breath coming in small puffs in the cold air. The meadow spread before them like a golden blanket, rimmed with aspens turning brilliant yellow. They worked in comfortable silence, filling baskets with the pungent bulbs. Clara had grown confident in the mountains these past weeks, learning to read the land the way Jed did. She was reaching for a cluster of onions near the creek when her foot slipped on the wet stones. She went down hard, crying out as pain shot through her ankle. Before she could even try to stand, Jed was there, kneeling beside her, his hands gentle but sure as they examined her foot. "Not broken," he said, but his frown deepened at her wince. "Sprained, maybe. Can you stand?" Clara tried, but the moment she put weight on the foot, her leg buckled. Jed caught her, and suddenly she was in his arms, held against his chest as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. She could feel the heat of him through his shirt, smell the mix of leather and pine that always clung to him. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "No, you can't." His voice was gruff, but his arms were steady and strong around her. "Stop being stubborn." He carried her down the mountain as if she were precious cargo, taking care with each step. Clara, her arms around his neck for balance, fought the urge to rest her head against his shoulder. This was just necessity, she told herself. Just a practical solution to a practical problem. Back at the cabin, he set her gently on the bed and knelt to remove her boot. His fingers were careful, but she still gasped when he eased it off her swollen foot. "Needs wrapping," he said, already moving to tear strips from an old sheet. When he returned, he sat on the edge of the bed, lifting her foot onto his lap. Clara's breath caught. There was something almost unbearably intimate about the moment. Jed's large hands wrapping her ankle with focused care, the afternoon light slanting through the window, the quiet broken only by the whisper of cloth and their careful breathing. "There was a woman," Jed said suddenly, his eyes on his work. "Back in Missouri. We were engaged to be married." Clara held perfectly still, afraid any movement might stop the words she sensed he needed to say. "I was working as a deputy sheriff in Cedar Ridge. Good job, good prospects. Elizabeth, that was her name. She was the banker's daughter, pretty as a picture and knew it." His hands paused in their wrapping. "There was a robbery, bank got hit, and the banker, Elizabeth's father, he was shot, died right there in the street." He resumed wrapping, each turn precise and careful. "They needed someone to blame. Found the money in my saddlebags. Said I was working with the gang. Didn't matter that I'd been trailing them for weeks, that they'd planted it. Didn't matter that I'd never taken a dishonest dollar in my life." "Oh, Jed," Clara whispered. Elizabeth believed them. His voice was flat, emotionless. "Stood right there in the courthouse and said she'd always suspected I wasn't what I seemed. They couldn't prove anything solid, so I didn't hang, but I lost everything. Job, reputation, future." Elizabeth married the new deputy 6 months later. He tied off the bandage and finally looked up at her. "That's why I live out here. Can't be betrayed by mountains and cattle." Clara reached out without thinking, covering his hand with hers. "She was a fool." Something flickered in Jed's dark eyes. "Maybe. Or maybe she saw clearer than I did. Maybe she knew I wasn't meant for town life, for society dinners and Sunday socials. You're a good man. Jed Hartley, anyone with eyes can see that." They sat frozen, hands touching, eyes locked. The air between them crackled with possibility. Slowly, as if drawn by invisible strings, Jed leaned closer. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, her lips parting slightly. Then a log popped in the fireplace, loud as a gunshot. Jed jerked back, standing abruptly. "You should rest that foot," he said roughly. "I'll see to dinner." He strode outside. leaving Clara alone with her racing pulse and the ghost of what might have been. The next few days were excruciating. Jed was unfailingly polite but kept his distance, finding urgent tasks that took him away from the cabin for hours. Clara, hobbling on her wrapped ankle, threw herself into cooking and mending, trying to ignore the ache that had nothing to do with her injury. The storm came on the fourth night. Not snow yet, but a cold autumn rain that hammered the roof and turned the clearing to mud. Jed came in soaked to the skin after securing the horses, water streaming from his hat and coat. Clara had hot stew waiting and coffee strong enough to warm a dead man. She served him silently, then returned to her sewing by the fire. The tension stretched between them like a physical thing, made worse by the intimacy of being trapped inside by the weather. She was nearly ready to excuse herself to bed when the nightmare came. One moment she was stitching a torn shirt. The next she was back at the lake, naked and shivering, the cowboy's laughter echoing off the canyon walls. But in the dream, no one came. She screamed for help until her throat was raw, but the water rose higher, pulling her down into its dark depths. "Clara! Clara! Wake up!" She came to consciousness fighting, striking out at the hands that held her. Then Jed's voice penetrated the terror, low and steady. "It's all right. You're safe. It's just a dream." She was in the bed, twisted in the quilts, her face wet with tears. Jed sat on the edge of the mattress, his hands gripping her shoulders, anchoring her to reality. Lightning flickered outside, illuminating his concerned face. "The lake!" she gasped. "I was back at the lake, and they—" "Shh!" He pulled her against him, and she went willingly, burying her face against his shoulder. "It's over. You're here. You're safe." She clung to him, breathing in his solid warmth, feeling the strong beat of his heart under her cheek. His hand came up to stroke her hair, gentle and soothing. They stayed that way for long minutes, the storm raging outside while Clara let Jed's presence chase away the demons. Finally, she pulled back slightly, suddenly aware that she wore only her thin night shift, that they were alone in the near darkness with only firelight between them. Jed seemed to realize it too, his hand stilled in her hair, his breath catching. "Clara," he said, her name a question and a warning all at once. She answered by reaching up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of stubble under her palm. "I'm not Elizabeth. I won't leave." He closed his eyes as if in pain. "You don't know what you're saying. You're young. You've been through hell. You're not thinking clear. I've never thought clearer." She shifted closer, feeling bold and terrified at once. "I know you feel it too. Jed, this thing between us." His eyes opened, dark and intense in the firelight. "Feeling it and acting on it are two different things. You deserve better than a broken-down cowboy hiding from the world. You deserve a proper husband, a home in town, children. I deserve," Clara said firmly, "to make my own choices, and I choose you." The last of his resistance crumbled, with a sound that was part groan, part surrender. He pulled her to him and kissed her with all the pent-up longing of the past weeks. Clara responded with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jed rested his forehead against hers. "This changes everything." "Yes," Clara agreed softly. "Everything." He kissed her again, gentler this time, then stood with visible effort. "Not tonight. Not like this. It'll be done right." Clara wanted to protest, but she saw the struggle in his face and loved him for it. Because she did love him. She realized, somewhere between that first rescue and this moment, she'd given her heart to this quiet, wounded man. "All right," she whispered. Jed moved to the door, then turned back. "I'm not good with words. Clara, never have been, but you need to know, you've brought something back to life in me, something I thought was dead and buried." Then he was gone, back out into the storm, leaving Clara alone with the warmth of his kisses still on her lips, and the promise of tomorrow singing in her heart. The morning after the storm dawned crisp and clear. But the air between Clara and Jed had changed, charged with unspoken promises and careful distances. He was already gone when she woke, leaving only the usual coffee and biscuits. But this time, there was also a small bunch of wild asters in a tin cup on the table, purple and white stars against green stems, still damp with morning dew. Clara touched the delicate petals, a smile playing at her lips. It was such a simple gesture, but from a man like Jed, it spoke volumes. She tucked one bloom behind her ear and went about her morning chores with a lighter heart. But the lightness didn't last. Just past noon, as Clara was hanging wash on the line strung between two pines, she heard horses approaching, multiple horses, moving fast. Her blood ran cold. Had the cowboys found her? Or worse, had Uncle Silas somehow tracked her here? She ducked inside, peering through the window. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, but these weren't the young cowboys from the lake. The man in front wore black broadcloth and a white collar, a preacher's garb. The other 2 looked like hired hands, tough and weathered. The preacher dismounted with surprising grace for a man of his bulk. He had a face like spoiled dough, pasty and soft, with small eyes that darted everywhere at once. Clara's instincts screamed danger. "Hello, the house," the preacher called. "Looking for Jed Hartley. Got business with him." Clara stayed silent, hoping they'd assume no one was home. But the wet clothes on the line gave her away. The preacher's eyes fixed on them, particularly on the blue calico dress. "I know someone's in there," he said, his voice taking on an oily quality. "Come on out. We don't mean no harm." Left with no choice, Clara stepped onto the porch, keeping the door frame at her back. "Mr. Hartley's not here. You'll have to come back another time." The preacher's eyes swept over her, and Clara fought the urge to cover herself despite being fully dressed. Well, and who might you be? Miss? That's none of your concern. State your business or move along." Feisty. The preacher smiled, showing too many teeth. "I'm Reverend Josiah Polk from Cedar Ridge. These are my associates, Mr. Grimm and Mr. Harlan. We're looking for a young woman who ran off from her family. Caused quite a stir. Her uncle's offering a reward for her safe return." Clara's heart hammered, but she kept her expression neutral. "I wouldn't know about that." "No, pretty young thing like you, living alone with a man like Hartley? That's mighty interesting." Polk took a step closer. "This girl, she's about your height, your coloring, went by the name Clara Bell." Before Clara could respond, the sound of a horse at full gallop reached them. Jed burst into the clearing, rifle already in his hands. He took in the scene at a glance. Clara backed against the door. Polk and his men spread out like they were surrounding prey. "That's close enough. Polk," Jed said, dismounting smoothly, the rifle never wavering. "State your business and git." "Jed Hartley." Polk's smile widened. "Been a while. Heard you were hiding up here like a hermit. Didn't expect to find you keeping company. What I do is my business. Is it now? Even when that company might be a runaway? A girl who abandoned her family, broke her poor uncle's heart." Polk's eyes glittered with malice. "Could be quite the scandal. Former deputy, already suspected of crimes, now harboring a fugitive female. What would people think?" Jed's jaw tightened. "They'd think what they always think. Whatever you tell them to. Now. No need for unpleasantness. I'm sure we can come to an arrangement. The girl comes with us, goes back to her family where she belongs. And nobody needs to hear about what's been going on up here. She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go," Jed said flatly. Clara stepped forward, fear replaced by anger. "My uncle sold me, like livestock, to a man who beats women for sport. Is that the family you think I should return to, Reverend?" Polk's expression didn't change. "Marriage is a sacred bond. Sometimes young women need guidance to understand their duties." "Get off my land," Jed said, his voice deadly quiet. "Now." Grimm and Harlan exchanged glances, hands drifting toward their guns. The tension stretched taut as wire. "This isn't over," Polk said finally. "That girl is promised to Luther Briggs, and promises made before God must be kept. We'll be back. With the law, if necessary." They mounted and rode off, but Clara could feel Polk's eyes on her until the trees swallowed them up. Only then did her knees give out. Jed caught her, rifle clattering to the ground as he pulled her against him. "They'll come back," she whispered against his chest. "They'll bring others. I've ruined everything for you." "Hey!" He tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You've ruined nothing? Let them come. You don't understand. My uncle, Luther, they have money, influence. They can make trouble for you. And after what happened before, I know exactly what they can do." His thumb brushed across her cheek, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Difference is, this time I've got something worth fighting for." That evening, Jed was quieter than usual, but it was a different kind of silence, the kind that came before a storm. After dinner, he pulled out paper and ink, writing several letters with laborious care. Clara didn't ask what they said. "Pack what you need," he said when he finished. "We're going to town tomorrow." Clara's stomach dropped. "You're taking me back." His head snapped up, eyes flashing. "Never. But if Polk's going to make trouble, we need to be ready. There are things to be done. Legal things." "I don't understand." Jed stood, crossing to where she sat by the fire. He knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Clara Bell, I'm not good at pretty speeches, but I know what I want, and that's you, safe, protected, where nobody can force you to do anything against your will." Clara's breath caught. "Jed, what are you saying?" "I'm saying we go to town tomorrow and find a judge. Make it legal. Make it so your uncle and Luther Briggs and Josiah Polk have no claim on you." He squeezed her hands gently. "If you'll have me." The world seemed to stop. Clara looked into the face of this good man who'd saved her in every way a person could be saved, who was offering to bind his life to hers to keep her safe. But more than that, she saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that she might say no. "You're proposing," she whispered. "I know it's not romantic. I know you deserve better, flowers and courting and time to decide, but we might not have time. And He stopped, struggling for words. "I love you. Clara, maybe that's foolish after so short a time, but it's true. I loved you from the moment I saw you in that lake. So brave despite being afraid. I love your strength, your kindness, the way you've made this empty cabin feel like home. I love—" Clara silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her feelings into the contact. When they parted, both breathless, she smiled through her tears. Yes, I'll marry you, Jed Hartley, today, tomorrow, whenever you want." He pulled her down into his arms, holding her like she might disappear. "It won't be easy. People will talk. Your uncle might cause problems. Let them talk. Let him try." Clara pulled back to look at him. "I'm not Elizabeth, remember? I don't care about society's opinion. I care about you, about us, about the life we can build together." Jed's smile was like sunrise after a long night. He kissed her again, deeper this time, with promise and passion. When he finally pulled away, they were both shaking. "Tomorrow, then," he said roughly. "We'll leave at first light." "And tonight?" Clara asked, feeling bold. His eyes darkened, but he shook his head with gentle firmness. "Tonight you sleep in that bed alone one last time. Tomorrow night." He let the promise hang in the air between them. Clara nodded, understanding and loving him more for his restraint. She'd been treated like property, like something to be bartered and sold. Jed was giving her the dignity of choice, of time, of doing things properly even in their improper situation. But sleep eluded her that night. She lay in the narrow bed, listening to Jed's breathing from his place by the fire, and thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the wagon train to the lake, from terror to safety, from loneliness to love. Tomorrow she would become Clara Hartley, and the thought filled her with a fierce joy. Just before dawn, she heard Jed stirring through the blanket partition. She watched his shadow as he shaved carefully, put on his best shirt, the one she'd mended with tiny, careful stitches. He was nervous. She realized with a surge of tenderness, This man who faced down threats without flinching was nervous about marrying her. "Jed," she called softly. His shadow stilled. "Did I wake you?" "No, I couldn't sleep either." She paused, then added, "I love you too. I forgot to say it yesterday, but I do. I love you." The shadow moved closer to the partition, and she could almost feel him there, just inches of fabric between them. "Then let's go make it official, soon to be Mrs. Hartley." Clara smiled in the darkness. Whatever came next, Polk's threats, her uncle's anger, society's judgment, they would face it together. And that, she thought as the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, made all the difference in the world. The town of Pine Ridge sat in a valley between two mountain ranges, a collection of wooden buildings that looked as if they'd been dropped carelessly along a muddy main street. Clara had never seen it before, having bypassed it entirely during her escape from the wagon train. Now, riding behind Jed on his bay horse, wearing her best dress, the blue calico that had been his mother's, she felt exposed and vulnerable despite his solid presence. They'd left before dawn, taking the mountain trails Jed knew like the lines on his own hands. He'd been quiet during the ride, but his arm around her waist had been steady, protective. Now, as they entered the town proper, Clara felt him tense. "Justice of the peace is at the end of the street," he said quietly. "Samuel Morrison, fair man. He'll do right by us." They dismounted in front of a small building that served as both courthouse and land office. Jed helped Clara down, his hands lingering on her waist for just a moment. "Ready?" She nodded, though her heart was racing. They'd taken perhaps 3 steps when a familiar voice called out, "Well, if it isn't the runaway bride herself." Clara froze. Luther Briggs stood in front of the saloon, flanked by 2 rough-looking men. He was exactly as she'd remembered, thick-bodied, with mean little eyes and hands like ham hocks, the kind of man who enjoyed his own cruelty. "Clara Bell," Luther said, moving closer. "Your uncle's been mighty worried. Had us all out looking for you." Jed stepped slightly in front of Clara. "She's not your concern. Briggs? Is that so?" Luther's eyes narrowed. "Seems to me she has paid good money for her. 2 mules and a rifle ain't cheap." "I'm not property to be bought," Clara said, finding her voice. "Whatever arrangement you had with my uncle is void." Luther laughed, an ugly sound. "Void? Little girl, you don't know how the world works. Your uncle's your legal guardian. He made a deal. You're mine." "Not anymore," Jed said flatly. "We're here to see Judge Morrison. In an hour. She'll be my wife." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Luther's face darkened. "Your wife? You think putting a ring on her finger changes anything? I paid for her fair and square." "Then I'll pay you back," Jed said. "Name your price." "It ain't about the money." Luther moved closer, and Clara could smell the whiskey on his breath. "It's about principle. Man makes a deal, he keeps it. Besides," his eyes raked over Clara in a way that made her skin crawl, "I was looking forward to breaking her in, teaching her proper respect." Jed's fist connected with Luther's jaw before Clara even saw him move. Luther went down hard in the muddy street, blood streaming from his nose. His men started forward, but Jed already had his Colt drawn. "Anyone else want to discuss my fiancé's future?" His voice was deadly calm. A crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Among them, Clara spotted Reverend Polk, watching with those calculating eyes. This wasn't over. She knew. Not by a long shot. "Come on," Jed said, holstering his gun and taking Clara's arm. "Judge is waiting." Judge Samuel Morrison was indeed waiting, having heard the commotion outside. He was a thin man with kind eyes behind wire spectacles, his office lined with law books and maps. "Jed Hartley," he said, rising from behind his desk. "Been a while. Heard you had some trouble outside." "Nothing that won't keep," Jed replied. "We're here to be married. Sam, legal and proper." The judge's eyes moved to Clara, taking in her pale face and determined expression. "This young lady being forced?" "No, sir," Clara said firmly. This is my choice, my only choice. Morrison nodded slowly. There's been talk. Girl run off from a wagon train. Uncle looking for her. You that girl? Clara lifted her chin. My uncle tried to sell me to Luther Briggs. I ran because I wouldn't be sold like cattle. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth, Clara said. My father died on the trail. My uncle saw an opportunity to rid himself of a burden and make a profit. Judge Morrison, I'm of age. I can make my own decisions. And I choose to marry Jed Hartley. The judge studied them both for a long moment. Then he smiled. Well then, let's make it legal. You'll need witnesses. I'll stand witness. They turned to find Mrs. Morrison in the doorway. A plump woman with silver hair and a no-nonsense manner. Behind her stood Thomas Chen, who ran the general store, and his wife, Mary. Heard there might be a wedding. Mrs. Morrison said, thought you could use some friendly faces. The ceremony was simple but moving. Clara's hands shook as she repeated the vows, but her voice was strong. Jed's eyes never left her face, and when Judge Morrison pronounced them man and wife, the kiss they shared was tender and full of promise. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Hartley, the judge said, signing the marriage certificate with a flourish. May I suggest you make copies of this document? Something tells me you might need them. They were walking back to the horse when Polk appeared, Luther and several other men behind him. Luther's face was swollen, his eyes murderous. This ain't over, he snarled. That piece of paper don't mean nothing. It means everything, Clara said, surprising herself with her boldness. I'm a married woman now. You have no claim on me. Your uncle still has rights. Polk interjected smoothly. He could contest this marriage. Say you weren't of sound mind. Say Hartley here coerced you. Let him try. Jed said, We'll be ready. They rode out of town with Clara wearing Jed's ring, a simple gold band he'd produced from his pocket, worn smooth with age. It was my mother's too, he'd said quietly as he slipped it on her finger. Kept it all these years, never knowing why. Guess I was waiting for you. The cabin looked different when they returned. Same rough logs, same simple furnishings. But now it was truly home. Their home. Clara stood in the doorway, suddenly nervous. Everything had happened so fast. This morning she'd been Clara Bell, alone in the world. Now she was Clara Hartley, a married woman with a husband who stood behind her. Waiting. Second thoughts? Jed asked softly. She turned to face him. Never. You? Instead of answering, he swept her up in his arms, carrying her over the threshold. Old tradition, he said, setting her down gently inside. For luck. They stood facing each other in the familiar room, but everything had changed. The air between them crackled with possibility and permission. Clara reached up to touch his face, marveling that she had the right now. I love you, she said simply. Jed covered her hand with his, pressing it against his cheek. I never thought I'd have this, a wife, a home, a future. He pulled her closer. You've given me back my life, Clara. She rose on her toes to kiss him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they parted, both were breathing unsteadily. The sun's still high, Clara said, suddenly shy. There are chores. The chores can wait, Jed said roughly. I've waited long enough. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Clara felt herself melting against him. This was her husband, she thought with wonder. This strong, gentle man who'd saved her, protected her, married her to keep her safe. But more than that, he loved her. She could feel it in every touch, every glance, every careful gesture. Later, much later, they lay entwined in the narrow bed that no longer seemed too small. Golden afternoon light slanted through the window, painting patterns on the quilt. Clara's fingers traced lazy circles on Jed's chest, marveling at the intimacy of it. What are you thinking? He asked, his voice rumbling under her ear. That I'm happy? She said honestly. Happier than I ever thought possible. Is that foolish? If it is, then I'm foolish too. He pressed a kiss to her hair. But we need to be ready. Polk was right about one thing. Your uncle might cause trouble, and Luther won't give up easy. Then we'll face them together. Clara propped herself up to look at him. I'm not afraid anymore. Jed, not with you beside me. He studied her face, then smiled. A real smile that transformed his weathered features. My brave girl, my wife. The wonder in his voice made her heart skip. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and bringing the scent of snow. Winter was coming to the mountains, but inside their cabin, wrapped in each other's arms and the warmth of new love. Clara and Jed Hartley were already home. That night, as Clara drifted toward sleep, she thought about the strange path that had brought her here, the loss of her father, the betrayal of her uncle, the humiliation at the lake. All of it had led to this moment, this man, this life. She wouldn't change any of it. She realized every hardship had been worth it to find her way to Jed. No regrets, he murmured in the darkness, as if reading her thoughts. None, she whispered back. Not one. And she meant it. Whatever tomorrow brought, angry relatives, social censure, legal challenges, they would weather it as they would weather the coming winter. Together, united and unafraid. She was Clara Hartley now, and that simple fact filled her with a fierce, protective joy that burned brighter than any fear. In the darkness, Jed's arms tightened around her, and Clara smiled. She was home. The confrontation came 3 weeks after the wedding, on a cold November morning when frost silvered the ground and breath came in white puffs. Clara was drawing water from the well when she heard the horses. Too many horses for friendly visitors. Her hand went instinctively to the rifle Jed had taught her to use, propped against the cabin wall. Stay inside, Jed said quietly. Emerging from the barn with his own Winchester, his face had gone hard. The gentle husband transformed into the former lawman. No matter what happens, but Clara had never been good at hiding. She stood in the doorway, rifle in hand. As 8 riders entered their clearing, Luther Briggs led them, flanked by Reverend Polk and a man wearing a sheriff's badge. Her uncle Silas brought up the rear, looking older and meaner than she remembered. Jed Hartley, the sheriff called out. I'm Sheriff Wallace from Cedar Ridge. We need to talk. Talk, then, Jed replied, the rifle resting easy in his hands but ready. This man, Polk gestured at Silas, says his niece was kidnapped, held against her will. He's filed charges. That's a lie. Clara stepped forward, ignoring Jed's sharp look. I left of my own free will because he tried to sell me to Luther Briggs. Silas spat tobacco juice. Girl's touched in the head. Death of her PA broke her mind. Doesn't know what she's saying. Seemed clear-headed enough when she married me, Jed said evenly. A marriage performed under duress, Polk interjected smoothly. A young girl, traumatized, taken advantage of by a man with a questionable past. Any court would see it plain. Sheriff Wallace looked uncomfortable. Now, I don't like this any more than you do. Hartley, but the law's the law. If her legal guardian says she was taken against her will, I'm his wife, Clara said firmly. That makes him my legal guardian now, doesn't it? Not if the marriage ain't valid, Luther growled. Girl was promised to me. Money changed hands. That's a legal contract. You want your money back? Jed asked. Fine. What did you pay? 2 mules and a rifle? I'll give you 3 mules and 2 rifles. Call it interest. It ain't about the money. Luther's face was red with rage. It's about what's mine by rights. I am no one's property, Clara said, her voice ringing clear in the cold air. Not my uncle's to sell, not yours to buy. I'm a free woman who made her own choice. Free woman, Silas scoffed. You're a silly girl who needs a firm hand. Always were too much like your mother, wild, headstrong. Look where it got her, dead before 30. Clara felt Jed tense beside her, but she put a hand on his arm. My mother died of childbed fever. Uncle, not from being headstrong. Though I thank God she had enough spirit to raise me to think for myself before she passed. Enough talk, Sheriff Wallace said. Here's what's going to happen. The girl, Mrs. Hartley, is going to come with us, just to town, just to sort this out legal-like. Judge Morrison can hear all sides and make a ruling." "No," Jed said flatly. "Now, Hartley, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Nobody wants bloodshed." "Then you'd best ride on. My wife stays here." The tension stretched taut. Hands drifted toward guns. Clara counted the odds, 8 of them. 2 of her and Jed. Not good, but she'd seen her husband shoot. He could account for at least 3 before they got him. Maybe 4. "Wait," a new voice called from the tree line. Thomas Chen emerged on his small cart, but he wasn't alone. Behind him rode Mrs. Morrison and Mary Chen. But more surprisingly, a dozen men from town, shopkeepers, ranchers, even the blacksmith. "Tom," Sheriff Wallace said warily, "this ain't your concern." "I think it is," Chen replied calmly. "When men come to drag a woman from her home, it concerns all decent folk. We ain't dragging nobody." Wallace protested. "Just want to talk to the judge." "Then talk, Mrs." Morrison said from her perch on the wagon seat. "Judge Morrison sent me to say he'll hear the case. Right here, right now. No need to haul anybody anywhere. That ain't proper procedure." Polk began, but Mrs. Morrison cut him off. "Neither is 8 armed men surrounding a cabin to intimidate a young couple. You want proper? Let's be proper. Present your evidence." Clara felt a surge of hope. Jed must have sent word to town after all. Those letters he'd written. He'd prepared for this. Evidence? Silas stepped forward. "I'm her blood kin. Her PA died. That makes me responsible for her." "Were you appointed her legal guardian by a court?" "Mrs." Morrison asked. "Didn't need no court. I'm her uncle." "So you have no legal documentation, and Mrs. Hartley. You're how old?" 21 come January. Clara replied. "Old enough to make her own choices. Next." Luther pushed forward. "I paid for her. Got witnesses." "You paid him, Mrs." Morrison pointed at Silas. "Not her. If I sell you my neighbor's horse, does that make it yours?" "That's different." "How? You can't sell what you don't own. Mr. Briggs and Mr. Silas here didn't own his niece. The marriage ain't valid." Polk tried. "Hartley's got a criminal past. He coerced her." This was the moment Clara had dreaded. But Jed spoke up, his voice clear and strong. "I was accused of a crime in Cedar Ridge. Never convicted, never even tried, because there was no evidence. Just suspicion and the word of a banker who needed someone to blame for his own failings." "That's not," Wallace began. But an old man Clara didn't recognize stepped forward from the crowd. "Name's Josiah Adler," he said. "I was sheriff in Cedar Ridge before you." "Wallace, I remember the case. Hartley was a good deputy. The evidence against him was planted. I'd stake my reputation on it, but the town needed someone to blame, and Hartley was an outsider. Easier to point fingers at him than look at their own." "Even so," Polk persisted. "The girl was clearly traumatized when he found her, not in her right mind to make decisions." "I found her, yes," Jed said. "But I never forced anything. Ask anyone who's seen us together. Ask her yourself." All eyes turned to Clara. This was her moment. She realized her chance to speak her truth before witnesses. "Yes, I was traumatized," she said, her voice starting soft but growing stronger. "I'd lost my father. My uncle betrayed me. I was robbed and humiliated by men who thought it was funny to steal a woman's clothes while she bathed. I was alone and afraid and had nothing left in the world." She looked at Jed, letting her love shine through. "And then this man found me. He could have taken advantage, could have turned me in for the reward my uncle offered, could have used my vulnerability against me. Instead, he gave me shelter, respect, protection. He gave me time to heal, to find myself again. And when I did, I found I loved him." Clara turned back to the crowd. "If that's coercion, then I pray every woman finds such gentle coercion. If marrying a man who treats me as an equal instead of property makes me mad, then I'll gladly be mad. But I know my own mind, gentlemen, and my mind, heart and soul belong with my husband." Silence fell over the clearing. Even Luther seemed momentarily struck dumb. "Well, Mrs." Morrison said briskly, "I think that settles it. The marriage is legal, the lady's of age and sound mind, unless you have real evidence of a crime. Sheriff Wallace, I suggest you and these men get off the Hartley property." Wallace looked relieved. "You heard the lady? Mount up, boys. This ain't over," Luther snarled. "You can't just—" "Yes, it is." Thomas Chen interrupted. "You've lost Briggs. Accept it with what dignity you have left. And if you come near my wife again," Jed added quietly, "there won't be any talking. Just you and me and whatever God you pray to." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Luther's face went purple, but Polk put a hand on his arm. One by one, the riders turned and left. Silas was the last to go, staring at Clara with something like bewilderment. "Your PA would be ashamed," he said finally. "No," Clara replied firmly. "He'd be proud. He raised me to be strong, to make my own choices. You never understood that about him. Or me. When they were gone." Clara's knees nearly buckled. Jed caught her, holding her close as the townspeople gathered around, offering congratulations and support. "Mrs." Morrison pressed a basket of preserves into Clara's hands. "Welcome to Pine Ridge properly, Mrs. Hartley. We take care of our own here." Later, after everyone had gone and the sun was setting behind the mountains, Clara and Jed sat together on the porch steps. The rifle was back in its place by the door, the clearing peaceful again. "You sent those letters to rally the town," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "I've learned something about fighting accusations." Jed replied, "Better to have witnesses on your side from the start." "Do you think they'll come back?" Jed was quiet for a moment. "Luther might try something, but Polk's too smart to push it now that the town's involved. And your uncle, I think he knows he's lost." Clara leaned against his shoulder. "I meant what I said. Every word. I know." He kissed the top of her head. "You're quite a woman, Clara Hartley, standing up to them all like that." "I learned from the best," she said, thinking of that first day when he'd stood between her and the world, offering nothing but protection and asking nothing in return. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear. Two people who'd found each other against all odds. The threat might not be completely gone, but they'd faced it together and won. And Clara knew, deep in her bones, that whatever came next, they'd face that together too. "No regrets?" Jed asked, echoing their wedding night. "Only one," Clara said, and felt him tense. She smiled in the darkness. "I wish we'd met sooner. Think of all the time we wasted not knowing each other." His laughter rumbled through his chest, and he pulled her closer. "We've got the rest of our lives to make up for it." And there, on the porch of their mountain cabin, with the vast wilderness stretching out before them and the warmth of community at their backs, Clara knew he was right. The rest of their lives sounded just about perfect. Winter arrived with a vengeance, transforming the mountains into a glittering wonderland of ice and snow. The first blizzard caught them prepared. Jed had spent weeks cutting firewood, chinking gaps in the cabin walls, and laying in supplies. Clara had preserved vegetables from the garden, smoked venison, and filled the root cellar with potatoes and turnips. Now, as December deepened, they settled into the rhythm of winter life. The days were short, darkness falling by late afternoon, but the evenings by the fire were long and sweet. Clara had never imagined such contentment was possible, working alongside her husband, sharing quiet meals, falling asleep in his arms while snow whispered against the windows. "You're getting good at that," Jed observed, watching her clean his Winchester with practiced movements. Clara smiled. "I had a good teacher." She'd insisted on learning everything: how to shoot, how to track, how to read weather signs. The mountains were beautiful but unforgiving, and she refused to be helpless. "Tomorrow we'll check the trap lines," he said. "If you're up for it. Snow's deep." "I'm up for anything," Clara replied, meaning it. Each day brought new challenges, new skills to master. Last week, Jed had taught her to set snares. The week before, how to dress a deer. She was becoming a true mountain woman, and the knowledge filled her with pride. The next morning dawned crystal clear, the temperature well below freezing. Clara dressed in layers, wool under things, her warmest dress, Jed's old coat that she'd taken in to fit, and the fur-lined boots he'd traded for in town. She looked nothing like the frightened girl at the lake, and everything like a frontier wife. They set out on snowshoes, Jed breaking trail with Clara following in his steps. The world was hushed under its blanket of white, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Clara had never experienced such cold, but she found it exhilarating rather than miserable. The first trap was empty. The second held a fox whose pelt would fetch good money in town. Jed reset the traps while Clara watched, memorizing the process. They were working their way along the creek when it happened. Clara heard the growl first, low, menacing, far too close. She turned to see a gray wolf emerging from the trees, lips pulled back from yellow fangs. It was thin, desperate, driven down from the higher elevations by the harsh weather. "Don't move," Jed said quietly, his hand going to his rifle. But the wolf was already lunging, not at Jed but at Clara, perhaps seeing her as the weaker prey. She threw herself sideways, the wolf's jaws snapping shut inches from her throat. She hit the snow hard, rolling, reaching for the pistol at her belt. Jed's rifle cracked once, but the wolf had already twisted away. It came at Clara again, and this time she was ready. The pistol bucked in her hand. Once, twice, the wolf yelped, stumbled, then collapsed in the snow, red spreading beneath its gray coat. "Clara!" Jed was beside her in an instant, hands running over her, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt? Did it get you?" "I'm fine," she gasped, adrenaline making her shake. "I'm fine. Jed!" He pulled her against him, and she could feel his heart hammering. "You did good. You did real good. That was a perfect shot." Looking at the dead wolf, Clara felt a mix of sadness and triumph. She defended herself, proven she could survive, but she also understood the wolf's desperation, the hunger that had driven it to attack. "We should take it," she said quietly. "The pelt's good, and the meat, someone in town might need it." Jed studied her face, then nodded. "You're thinking like a mountain woman now." They were skinning the wolf when Jed hissed in pain. Clara looked up to see blood seeping through his coat sleeve. "You're hurt." She pushed his coat back to reveal deep scratches along his forearm. "When did this happen?" "Must have caught me when it first charged. Didn't notice." He tried to pull away. "It's nothing. It's not nothing." Clara's voice was firm. "We're going back, now. Those need cleaning before they fester." For once, Jed didn't argue. By the time they reached the cabin, his face was pale, the scratches angry and swollen. Clara's heart raced, but she kept her hands steady as she cleaned the wounds with whiskey, packed them with a poultice of herbs she'd learned from Mary Chen, and wrapped them in clean bandages. That night, Jed developed a fever. Clara sat beside the bed, cooling his forehead with damp cloths, forcing willow bark tea between his lips. He muttered in his delirium about the robbery he'd been accused of, about Elizabeth's betrayal, about losing Clara. "I'm here," she whispered, holding his hot hand. "I'm not going anywhere. Fight this. Jed, come back to me." The fever broke near dawn. Jed opened clear eyes to find Clara slumped in the chair beside him, still holding his hand. "Hey," he croaked. She jerked awake, tears of relief filling her eyes. "You're back. Thank God, you're back." "Takes more than a wolf scratch to kill a Hartley," he said weakly. Clara helped him drink water, checked his bandages, fussed over him until he caught her hand. "I'm okay, thanks to you. I was so scared," she admitted. "When the fever took you, I can't lose you. Jed, I can't." He pulled her down beside him on the bed, wrapping his good arm around her. "You won't, I promise." They lay together as the sun rose, and Clara felt something shift inside her. She'd saved him as he'd once saved her. They were truly partners now, equal in every way that mattered. Over the next week, as Jed healed, Clara took on his chores. She fed the horses, checked the cattle, kept the fires burning. The work was hard, but she found satisfaction in her growing competence. When Jed finally emerged, still weak but determined, he watched her with something like awe. "You've changed," he said one evening as she expertly butchered a rabbit for stew. "Have I?" Clara considered this. "I suppose I have. Is that bad?" "No, you're stronger than I ever imagined. Braver. You could survive out here without me." Clara set down her knife and crossed to where he sat. "But I don't want to. That's the difference. Jed, I could survive alone. But I choose to live with you. Every day. I choose you." He pulled her into his lap, kissing her deeply. "How did I get so lucky?" "We both got lucky," Clara corrected. "We found each other." The incident with the wolf had shaken them both, reminding them how quickly life could change in the mountains. But it had also proven something. They were no longer a man protecting a woman, but two people protecting each other. As Christmas approached, Clara threw herself into preparations. She made paper chains from old letters, baked cookies with their precious sugar, and even convinced Jed to help her drag in a small pine tree on Christmas Eve. As snow fell softly outside and the tree glowed with candles, they exchanged simple gifts. Clara had knitted Jed new mittens, and he'd carved her a set of wooden hair combs decorated with tiny flowers. "Next year," Clara said dreamily, leaning against him before the fire, "maybe we won't be alone. Maybe there will be 3 of us." Jed's hand stilled where it had been stroking her hair. "Clara, are you saying—" "Not yet," she said quickly. "But someday. Would you want that? Children?" His arms tightened around her. "With you? I'd want a dozen." Clara laughed. "Let's start with one and see how we do." That night, as the snow continued to fall and the fire burned low, they loved each other with a tenderness born of shared trials and mutual trust. Clara thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the wagon train to the lake, from fear to love, from helplessness to strength. "What are you thinking?" Jed murmured against her hair. "That, I'm grateful," Clara said. "For all of it, even the hard parts, because they brought me to you. My brave girl," he said softly. "My wife." Outside, wolves howled in the distance, but Clara felt no fear. She was home, safe in the arms of the man she loved, ready for whatever winter might bring. They'd faced down her past, survived the challenges of the present, and now looked forward to a future they would build together. "Merry Christmas." "Jed," she whispered. "Merry Christmas, Clara," he replied. And in those simple words was all the love and promise in the world. The winter stretched ahead, long and cold and challenging, but in their mountain cabin, with love to keep them warm and partnership to keep them strong, Clara and Jed Hartley were ready for anything. They'd been tested by fire and ice, by man and nature, and they'd emerged stronger for it. And Clara knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that this was just the beginning of their story. Spring came slowly to the mountains, winter releasing its grip with reluctance. The snow melted in patches, revealing the earth beneath, brown and waiting. Clara stood at the creek's edge, the same creek where she'd almost lost Jed to the wolf's attack, but now the water ran clear and cold with snowmelt. She'd come here to wash clothes, but found herself pausing, hand pressed to her still flat belly. 3 months now since she'd been certain, 2 since she'd told Jed. The joy on his face that night had been worth keeping the secret those extra weeks. Waiting to be sure. "You shouldn't be carrying that." Clara turned to find Jed approaching, his brow furrowed with concern. He'd become almost comically protective since learning of her condition, trying to stop her from lifting anything heavier than a coffee pot. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she said. "But let him take the wash basket. The women in town work until their time comes." "You're not the women in town." He set the basket down and pulled her close. "You're my wife, carrying my child. I have the right to fuss." Clara melted into his embrace, still marveling at how safe she felt in his arms. "I suppose you do, but I won't be coddled into uselessness. Jed Hartley. Wouldn't dream of it," he said. but she could hear the smile in his voice. They worked together at the creek, Jed hauling water while Clara scrubbed. The simple domesticity of it filled her with contentment. A year ago, she'd been running for her life. Now she was building one. "I've been thinking," Jed said as they headed back to the cabin. "Maybe we should consider moving to town, with the baby coming." "No." Clara's response was immediate and firm. "This is our home. This is where our child will be born. Clara, be reasonable. What if something goes wrong? We're hours from help up here." She stopped walking, turning to face him. "Mary Chen has delivered dozens of babies. She's already agreed to come when my time is near. Women have been having babies in cabins and wagons and wherever else life finds them since the beginning of time. But nothing." Clara touched his face gently. "This mountain, this cabin, this life we've built, this is where we belong, where our children will grow up free and strong. I won't give that up for the false safety of town." Jed studied her face, then nodded slowly. "All right, but we're laying in extra supplies, and at the first sign of trouble, we'll handle it." Clara finished, "Together, like we always do." As spring deepened into summer, Clara's body began to change. Her dresses grew tight, and Jed altered his old shirts to accommodate her expanding middle. She felt the first flutter of movement on a warm June evening. Grabbing Jed's hand and pressing it to her belly. "There," she whispered. "Did you feel it?" His eyes widened with wonder. "Was that—" "Our baby." Clara laughed at his expression, saying hello. From that moment, Jed took to talking to her belly each night, telling stories of the mountains, promises of fishing trips and horseback rides. Clara would run her fingers through his hair, feeling their child respond to its father's voice. The summer brought other changes too. Thomas Chen approached Jed about partnering in a horse breeding operation, Jed's knowledge and Chen's capital combining for mutual benefit. It would mean more work, but also steady income, security for their growing family. "It's a good offer," Clara said, reviewing the papers Chen had drawn up. Her father had taught her figures, and she'd taken over keeping the household accounts. "You think we should accept?" "I think," Clara said carefully, "that you've proven you're not meant to hide away forever. You're too good at what you do. This lets you work without giving up our home." The partnership was struck, and soon Jed was busy with a small herd of breeding mares. Clara helped when she could, her knowledge of horses growing under his tutelage. Even heavily pregnant, she could still evaluate conformation and temperament with an increasingly expert eye. August brought oppressive heat and Clara's increasing discomfort. She could no longer ride, could barely manage the garden, but she refused to complain, even when her back ached and her feet swelled. "You don't have to be so strong all the time," Jed told her one evening as he rubbed her feet. "It's all right to admit when you're hurting." "I'm not hurting," Clara protested, then gasped as the baby delivered a particularly vigorous kick. "Your child, however, seems determined to fight its way out." "Stubborn," Jed said with a grin. "Like its mother." "Protective," Clara countered. "Like its father." The pain started on a September morning, just as the aspens were beginning to turn gold. Clara had risen early, restless and uncomfortable. When the first wave hit, she gripped the table edge, breathing through it, then calmly began preparing. By the time Jed returned from the barn, she had water heating and clean linens ready. He took one look at her face and paled. "Is it time to fetch Mary Chen?" Clara said, then doubled over as another pain hit. Jed had never saddled a horse so fast. He was back with Mary in under 2 hours, finding Clara walking circles in the cabin, stopping to lean on furniture when the pains came. "How long?" Mary asked briskly, removing her coat. "Since dawn," Clara gasped. "They're getting stronger." What followed were the longest hours of Jed's life. He'd faced down outlaws and wolves with less fear than he felt watching Clara labor. But she was magnificent, focused, determined, drawing on that deep well of strength he'd always admired. "You're doing fine," Mary soothed as Clara cried out. "Baby's coming just right. Won't be long now." Jed held Clara's hand, letting her squeeze until his bones creaked, whispering encouragement and love. The sun was setting, painting the mountains gold and red, when their child finally entered the world. "It's a boy," Mary announced, cleaning the squalling infant. "Healthy and loud." Clara laughed through her tears as Mary placed the baby on her chest. "Hello, little one. Oh, Jed, look at him." Jed couldn't speak. His son, their son, was perfect. Tiny fists waved in the air, the baby's cries already calming at his mother's voice. When Clara transferred the infant to his arms, Jed felt his heart expand beyond what he'd thought possible. "What shall we call him?" Clara asked softly. Jed looked at his wife, brave, beautiful Clara, who'd given him everything he'd never dared dream of. "Samuel," he said. "After the judge who married us, Samuel James Hartley." "Samuel," Clara repeated, reaching up to touch both her boys. "It's perfect." That night, as Clara slept with the baby tucked beside her, Jed kept watch. He stoked the fire, checked the windows, marveled at the turn his life had taken. A year and a half ago, he'd been alone, convinced he'd stay that way. Now he had a wife he adored and a son to carry on his name. The baby stirred, making small sounds. Jed picked him up carefully, walking to the window where moonlight spilled across the floor. "See that?" he whispered to his son. "That's your land, these mountains, this valley, this life. It's all yours now. Your mama and I, we'll teach you to love it like we do, to respect it, to build something lasting on it." Samuel's eyes, still that newborn blue, seemed to focus on his father's face. Jed felt Clara's hand on his back and turned to find her standing there, wrapped in a blanket. "Couldn't sleep. Didn't want to miss this," she said softly. "My two men, planning the future." They stood together in the moonlight, their son between them. And Clara thought about that day at the lake, how terrified she'd been, how alone. Now she had everything: home, husband, child, a life built on love and mutual respect, far from the expectations and restrictions of society. "Do you ever think about it?" Jed asked quietly. "What would have happened if those cowboys hadn't taken your clothes? If I hadn't found you?" "Yes," Clara admitted. "And then I thank God they did, because it brought me to you, to this." She leaned into his solid warmth. "I wouldn't change a single thing. Jed, not one." He kissed the top of her head. "Then the babies." "Nor would I, though I might have wished for an easier introduction." Clara laughed softly, remembering her mortification, his careful averting of eyes. Where would be the story in that? When Samuel's older, we'll tell him how his parents met. Leave out a few details, perhaps. "Perhaps," Jed agreed, chuckling. They returned to bed. Samuel nestled between them. Outside, an owl called in the darkness, and the wind whispered through the pines. Their cabin stood strong against the night, a beacon of warmth and safety in the vast wilderness. Clara reached across their sleeping son to take Jed's hand. He squeezed gently, and she smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Raising a child in the mountains was no easy task, but tonight they were complete. A family forged from hardship, tested by trials, and bound by a love as enduring as the mountains themselves. She thought of the frightened girl at the lake, of the desperate woman who'd stumbled into Jed's protection. That woman could never have imagined this moment, safe, loved, her own child breathing softly beside her. Clara sent up a prayer of gratitude for the journey, difficult as it had been. "I love you," she whispered to her husband. "And I love you," he replied. "Both of you, always." "Always." Clara smiled, closing her eyes. It was a good word, a strong word, a promise and a certainty all at once. In this cabin, in these mountains, with these two precious souls beside her, always sounded just about perfect. The story of Clara and Jed Hartley had begun with loss and fear, but it had become something beautiful, a testament to the power of love, trust, and the courage to choose one's own path. And as the first light of dawn touched the mountains, painting them rose and gold, their greatest adventure was just beginning. Thank you for listening to this tale from the Wild West. If you enjoyed Clara and Jed's story, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect across the miles. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of love, adventure, and courage from America's frontier days. What did you think of Clara's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one.